Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Matthew Schmaltz, Professor of Religious Studies at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I'm the founding editor of the Journal of Global Catholicism, part of the Catholics and Cultures Initiative at Holy Cross's McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Judith Hahn, Professor of Canon Law on the Faculty of Catholic Theology in the University of Bonn. And Dr. Hahn's writings in both German and English are certainly voluminous and very influential. And her most recent writings in English are The Language of Canon Law, Church Law in Modernity, and the forthcoming Sacraments of the Law and Law of the Sacraments. Her writings particularly engage issues of the relationship between morality and textuality, as well as how modernity has challenged the canon law tradition in the Catholic Church. Dr. Judith Hahn, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so first, can you describe your intellectual journey and what brought you to canon law?
Yeah, I started studying theology, and I think I developed during my studies, kind of a fascination with norms, really. Norms are facts, but they're a peculiar kind of fact. And I got interested in how social facts and norms as social facts really build up rule systems, particularly complex ones, such as the Catholic Church. And then I was interested in theological disciplines, dealing with all kinds of normativities. And then I was lucky enough to get a job as a student assistant, working in social ethics at an institute that dealt with the ethics of economy and society. And parallel, I started studying canon law just to get more grasp on normativities, I guess. And then this kind of continued, and I met a nice canon law professor who said I could do a PhD in canon law, and then I did that. And then I was lucky enough to have to get a tenured position as a junior professor. This is a very specific German thing, I guess, in Bochum in 2010. And it was tenured, so it kind of continued from there. Then I got what in the American system would be an associate professorship in 2015, and then the full professorship. So it's kind of, there are a lot of coincidences which lead to that. But I think at the bottom of it is my interest in how you do complex normative systems, such as the Catholic Church, with all these layers of normativity, moral, social, legal, and so on. How do they work?
So then, that leads to the next question, and you've partially answered it. How would you characterize canon law, or both its study and its practice?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think there's a homogeneous thing that we can call canon law. I mean, we have various disciplinary approaches to canon law, really. I mean, just yesterday I read an article by a colleague who's a legal historian. He deals with medieval canon law, so he deals with canon law quite a lot, but he's a legal scholar, and this is a very different approach to what I what I do when I work with canon law. Or if you think, for example, of canonists, canon lawyers at the faculties of canon law in Italy, who I think work very close to legislation and understand their work very much also as a service to the church, interpreting the law, improving it, making it better, and so on. These are, I think, different experiences of canon law. For me, canon law in this German context, I think you have to understand it in the context. We are part of, I'm part of a faculty of Catholic theology, so part of colleagues which are all theologians. So I would always introduce myself as a theologian. So I'm a theologian with a legal expertise, different from other theologians with moral theology expertise or systematic theology and so on. So that, I think, shapes my understanding quite a bit. So that I usually ask, or understand myself as a theologian, would then ask, what can we contribute from a legal point of view to the study of theology? What is the legal perspective that helps us to scrutinize theological topics, for example? So what I do is, my research is very much in line with what's going on in the arts and philosophy, in cultural studies, also in social studies. And it's a very theological view of canon law and a very humanities view of the law, which, others might do differently, but this is how I experience canon law pretty much in my context.
I think, as you well know, one of the perceptions of canon law is that it's arcane, especially, and perhaps not that relevant to individual Catholic lives. So how would you respond to that? I mean, how would canon law, or how does canon law affect lived Catholicism?
I think there's some truth of that, what you said. Not because being a Cain is essentially bad or anything, but because I think that, yeah, well, the question is also the same thing. A lived Catholicism is, I think, a plural reality. And canon law has very different effects on that lived realities of people in the church. So depending on in which kind of Catholic bubble or in which kind of Catholic culture you're you might perceive of the law differently, and also depending on which legal matter is affected. But just maybe I might make a few examples to clarify my point. I think it really depends. We have Catholic local churches where people really, well, let's say, embrace the law, love the law as a medium of organizing the social. I think the US American Catholics or German Catholics, we really kind of, we like legal stuff. We easily engage with legal issues. And then there may be cultures, but probably you know better as an expert for Asian theology, for example, a context in which the law is not appreciated that much, where people might find it, yeah, maybe even irritating if you approach a religious issue with an instrument such as the law. John Hughes, a canonist, wrote, I'm not sure if he's right, but he wrote that, and I found that interesting that people, for example, with a strong connection to Confucianist thinking might have problems with that and saying the law is maybe it's a medium for organizing the social, but it's not our preferred one. So rather take other normative structures, other normativities for regulating the life of faithful. So it depends on these kind of issues, I guess. How do we approach the law? Are we urban Catholics or from rural areas? Right after the code was promulgated, there's a very, very interesting article by a bishop from the Andean region who said, I cannot deal with this kind of pastoral structure presented in the code. Doesn't fit my diocese in the Andes. It doesn't help me to organize my life here. And I think there's much truth of it. We have this wide, urban, rich structure in mind, or the legislator had it in mind when making the law. It doesn't fit all Catholic churches everywhere. So this really, I think, has an impact on which impact the law has and can have in local churches. Canon law is white law was something that Patricia Gola, an historian, I think, if I'm right, was the first African-American woman with a doctoral degree to serve in the Massachusetts state college system. And she wrote a very interesting article and said, must canon law be colorblind? And she really said, for the Black community, canon law is not helpful at all because it kind of misses the point. And she said that in 1972, so quite a while ago. And I think her criticism, which she's quite right in what she says, hasn't been received so much as it should, because I think these are factors that really impede law to be effective if you kind of miss the point of a community and are of no use for the people in the community. And then, yeah, of course, last but not least, Canada is a civil law system, and that there are interesting conflicts deriving from that in common law churches. For example, an Australian bishop, Geoffrey Robertson, who's also a canonist, and he said, like, in common law, we have like a liberal law. The law can be the legal text that can be quite ambiguous, and we can deal with it well because we apply a strict methodology and then derive the meaning of the law by being strict in interpreting it. Whereas canon law, as civil law, we have this kind of strict text of the law and then a very liberal interpretation. If you think of dispensation, whenever the law doesn't fit, oh, no problem, we dispense of it. And Robinson says that's very irritating for people from a common law background, because they really want a strict methodology to derive something which is kind of reliable and is to try to derive norms and rules out of the law which can be compared with each other, not this kind of dispensation practice, which for him was very, very random and very problematic. So I think it depends on these kind of factors. From which cultures do we come? And depending on that, canon law makes more or less sense in this context. And then also on the individual level, I think law still has canon law a massive impact on the reorganization of church structures in those areas, let me put it that way, in which the law basically works, one could say, automatically. if you study constitutional law, the law of offices and so on, there the law kind of organizes how the church is structured and restructured all the time. And that's pretty effective. And we don't even think about it. We just do it the way it is prescribed in the code. So that's very effective law. On the other hand, for example, if I study my culture here, and probably guess for the United States, something similar might be true. Whenever the law really depends on the personal decision of individuals to abide by it or not, at least here in Germany, we tend to dismiss it. We're not abiding by it. So whenever decision is involved, I really have to decide, do I want to follow? Do I want to marry in canonical form? Do I want to follow the obligation of go to confession annually as the law prescribes? Whenever decision is involved, people here at least tend to say, no, I don't. And that's funny. I just don't want to talk too long. But the funny thing about it is that not abiding by the law, I think this is something that kind of occurred to me over the last couple of years during the synodal path. For many liberal Catholics, the non-compliance with the law is actually part of their Catholic identity. So it's not just the law that can be part of our identity, but also refusing to follow the law can be part of an identity. So we have this huge debate here that law is unjust. Canon law has many regulations that for German Catholics or liberal German Catholics do not seem fit. And refusing to follow them, opposing them, is actually part of what has become part of their identity. I don't follow the law. I trust my conscience, for example, and don't abide by a law that I find unjust. That's very much part of the also reform debates here. So the law, and from a cultural studies point of view, that's very interesting, because it's not just the law that kind of forms and makes what we are and who we are, but also our sometimes contestation of the law or refusal to abide by it as part of Catholic identities. But I think it's a plural reality. We always have to speak with the people and ask, so how is it in your culture? How is it in your case? It's very different.
What would you say, and this follows up and in some ways overlaps with the previous question, what would you say, at least in the Western world, are some of the key challenges that canon law has to face in what people would call a secular age?
Most certainly, yeah. I think canon law is essentially and necessarily confronted with our perception of the law as we learn it as kids from secular state law. I think even when I say law, I think the first thing that comes to my mind often is secular law. I'm a canonist, but when I say law, I kind of think of the state and state law and all the standards that have become natural to us through state law, the rule of law, all these perceptions of how the law has to be reliable, clear, granting equality, abiding by the rule of law, and so on. And whenever canon law fails to respond to that fruitfully somehow, I think that there's an irritation coming from that it's just the case. I mean, you can, some canonists say, yeah, but canon law is different. Yeah, okay, canon law is different, but I think we cannot avoid that people measure it and assess it through the lens of our legal understanding that is very much that what we learned from growing up as kids in a state with the rule of law and so on. And I wouldn't exclude myself. So of course, when I say law, I think of state law, of the rule of law. And whenever canon law fails to respond to that, I find that problematic. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
To reflect perhaps my ignorance, what would you say is the future of natural law theory when it comes to canon law? And how much would you say, at least with the new code, you find natural law as a shaping fundamental element?
I think it's still very much in the new code. Whenever, for example, the code speaks of divine law, then you have the law of revelation, but also references to natural law. And that's very much, I think, part of the legal theory behind the code still. And I think in the United States, that is also a debate which is with regard to secular law, an interesting one. Whereas here in Europe, natural law theories are, I don't want to say dead, but they're not quite common anymore. After the war, there was this revival of natural law, and then this kind of ceased. So in the moment, in legal scholarship, people are actually not discussing natural law approaches. And I find that ambivalent. Well, on the one hand, I think it helps us to overcome what legislation in the church also has been accused of this kind of natural law positivism. You have the magisterium telling us what nature is and then deriving norms out of it and so on, which might not accord with the understanding of nature as many Christians or Catholics have it. So there's obviously a clash in what is natural and how can we derive norms from that. On the other hand, what struck me as problematic when thinking about that is that we have natural law traditions also in Judaism. David Novak, for example, has worked on that. The idea of laws that kind of apply to all. And there's also a growing, I think, tradition or approach in Islamic legal studies to understand natural law as a common basis for religions to talk about human rights, for example. So I'm from a German tradition, so we are kind of hesitant whenever natural law comes around the corner. We go like, ooh, yeah. But I learned from the debates with colleagues from the United States and also from interreligious dialogue that it's maybe not wise to cast this tradition aside, because it could actually help us to engage with other religions in, for example, the human rights discourse, and can be a helpful resource in this context, with all problems involved, of course. But I think this is a chance, and we should not really discard it.
That's fascinating. I mean, that you're arguing there can be a retrieval in some ways of natural law that, would serve interreligious dialogue in an important way.
With all care, yeah, because it also has the sides to it, which is really problematic, I think. But yeah, in interreligious dialogue, I'm careful to say, okay, I'm from Germany, we don't deal with natural law anymore, because that might take a chance away that we have for engaging in this interreligious discourse on the human rights, for example. Yeah.
Well, to conclude, would you share with us what you're working on, particularly the new monograph, Sacraments of the Law and the Law of the Sacraments?
Yeah, this is a monograph where I try to use, or I suggest carefully, I mean, everybody might make up their own mind, a sacramentality as a category, which I at least find helpful to understand how we make our social world. If you think of John Searle and his speech act approach, how do we shape institutions? How do we make them? And I try to learn from speech act theory, from sacramental theory, from legal studies, also ritual theory in particular, and symbol theory. What is this with sacraments? With things we do and perform, rituals we perform, which bring about that which they symbolize, to use this kind of tridentine speech.
Right.
So we have a ritual and it really changes the world in a religious sense by bringing about grace, but also in a legal sense. If you think of baptism, it's a religious sign. Obviously, it's about grace, but it's also has something to do with church membership. So here's something quite juridically happening. And what I do is I scrutinize this kind of sacro-legal symbols, ritual acts, which have social, religious, legal effects. And I think sacramentality might be a category, if you think about tridentine sacramental theology, with this very clear language describing how human beings, with the help of God in the Catholic view, but through performing certain actions, change the world. I think it might be helpful to connect these kind of discourses, for example, in speech act theory, with sacramental theology, for example.
Could you talk a little more, since this is an area that I'm interested in, about both ritual theory and how you're using it, and also theories of symbolism that inform your approach?
What I did when I started, I was really clueless, I have to admit. I started reading really traditional ritual theory, like Catherine Bell and Roy Rappaport, and these kind of really prominent figures in the debates on ritual theory. And what happened to me was I read that and I always was reminded kind of sitting in sacramental theology class, because parts of what they wrote was so close to really what we, when we study tridentine law on the sacrament, tridentine regulations on the sacraments, and so tridentine theology, that's what I wanted to say, on the sacraments. And then I started kind of to elaborate on these parallels. So what does it mean to use words? What does it mean to use gestures? What does it mean? What do you need for that? You need obviously a community in which this whole ritual is embedded, a community that kind of and not only knows how it has to be done, so there are obviously norms guiding people through ritual to do it right. If you don't do it right, it's not a ritual, it's nothing really. So you have certain norms that you have to abide by to get the ritual right. And then obviously you need some conventions and agreement on what is the effect of a ritual. So this is all very communal. It's all embedded in a group which accepts ritual as performative action and accepts the effects deriving from the ritual. So only in a context in which, for example, people believe that a person, on whose head you pour water is then a child of God, accept this effect. So you need belief. And Harold Berman once said, you need to believe in the law. So there's a parallel. You need to a group that accepts the effects of a certain ritual as binding, as something that then obliges the group to act according to it. And to treat this person as a member of the church, or for example, the ritual of a judge declaring someone guilty, then the group afterwards, after a person has been declared guilty, treats this person as a person who's an offender and so on. So these are all things that if we study them parallel, it's very interesting to see that much of what we do in sacramental theology, what is traditional Catholic doctrine on the sacraments, and much of what is ritual theory has elaborated over the past decades is very parallel. And what I do is then I go through these theories and show or discuss in what sense we can compare these bits and pieces. For example, the function of words, the function of gestures, the function of the community, the function of how much intention, how much inner stance do you need, for example, in the person acting and so on. These typical problems that basically sacramental theologians carry with them since Trent, which now in this broader context of ritual theory and also speech act theory show that it's not just about these symbols that we traditionally call sacraments in the Catholic Church, but rather about a whole array, I dare say, of social effects that work in a similar way. So if you study religious symbols or symbols that for us might be very mundane, the way in which we treat them and we produce them in ritual can be quite strikingly similar.
Okay.
If you think of the liturgy of adjudication, the judge and so on, everybody rising and the judge declaring guilty, irrespective of the person is truly guilty, then if the judge declares it, it happens. The person is an offender. So here's something taking place which I think we can compare without desacralizing what we think as religious individuals of what's happening there, and that God has a part to play in religious rituals, which he has not to play in, for example, in secular rituals. But there are obviously structures that are quite similar. That's quite, for me, it was really fascinating to read that and to learn more.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we have to end the conversation here, but I think the parallels to discussions in anthropology particularly are really persuasive and very, very interesting, and also symbolism, as you say, and also theories of speech acts. So that's a way of bringing canon law away from its perceived in any way arcane location into broader engagement with other academic theories. So Dr. Judith Hahn, thank you so much for being with us, and look forward to your new monograph and wish you all the best.
Well, thank you very much.